Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we learn Masechtas Bava Metzia, daf Pei Tes. We're going to begin on Pei Tes Amud Aleph, the sixth line from the top. Tanurban, Dayish. The pasuk is referring to threshing, so we make the following drush. Ma Dayish miyuchad davar shegidul karka. When it comes to threshing, it's something that comes from the ground. B'shas gemar malacha. And therefore the worker is allowed to eat from it because it grows from the ground. So too, what does that come to exclude? What is a worker not allowed to eat? When a person is involved in making milk or cheese, and it's not considered to be growing from the ground. So therefore, if let's say you have a poil who's milking a cow, he's not allowed to drink that milk. So on this, the Gemara wonders, so Lamali, we already have this pasuk that tells us this when he's in a vineyard, which is the ground. So why do you need this drush of Dayish? You would maybe think, since we were going down yesterday's daf, when it talked about standing grains, the Rabbi's kol bali kama, other food items as well, it was more inclusive. So Rabbo's nami needed a So maybe we're also including things that don't go from the ground. Kamash Malan. That's why I need the drush of Dayish. Okay. So let's just quickly see. Eil Gimel Devar Mu'manu Bechilos Poyel Medechsiv Dayish Me'inin Dumi de Dayish. So this is TB15. So one answer is it has to be something which is, let's see if I wrote this, Davar Mechuber Votolush. Okay, basically, Dayish, the first drasha, is Miyuchid, it's a Davar Shigiduli Karka, something that grows from the ground. Okay, let's continue. Gemara continues and says as follows: Tanidach Dayish, Ma Dayish Miyuchid Davar Shibashas Gemar Malacha Poi Oichaboy. This is the second drasha. That when it comes to Dayish, it's something which is only the worker is allowed to eat something in which is its final stages, like when he's harvesting. Now, kol shehu b'shas gemar malacha po oichabo. What does that come to exclude? So yatsa hamenachesh b'shumim b'tzom. A person is weeding onions and garlic. Koyel in gemar malacha. Since that's not considered gemar malacha, in po oichabahem. So again, lamali meve'el kel yachalitain nafka. The pasuk says don't put it into your kalim. So during the weeding, you're not putting anything to the kli anyway. So why would you need this drush? Well, tzricha afagav decham shalaf katini mibeni alimi. So even if, let's say, you're taking small onions into the kli from the large onions. Okay, let's look at Rashi. So Rashi says, yesh b'betzalim v'lohay gasim l'oil. There's some onions that are always going to be small. But you rip them up from the large ones to give more space. You can't learn out from that pasuk. Why? This is not at the time that it's the gemar malacha of these onions. The ikar pu'ulam mishum tikkun gedolim hu shehem mechubarim umdin. Because the main purpose are the ones in which are the large ones. So even though you are taking the small ones into your kli from amongst the large ones. So that's the second thing we learn from Dayish. So too, when it comes to Dayish, it's something in which is not considered to be Gemar Malacha regarding a Chi of Meiser. That's Poyel Oichabo. So that is really the third answer. Okay. So it has to be something in which there's no Chi of Meiser on yet. Okay. And that is Yatsa Haboidel Batamarim Vigrigris, the person who's separating dates and these dried figs. Hoyel Venigma Malachta Lamaiser, since there's a chiyuv at that point already in Meiser for these things. So therefore, in Poyochabo, you can't eat them. I Vasanya Haboida Batamarim Vigrigris Poyochabo. We went elsewhere that Taka, the Poyol could eat these things. So Amra Papa Kitanyahi, when do we say this? Is only b'toich lane. Says Rashi, Tamarim Royim, Shin Misbashlin B'ilin. These are poor quality dates that will not grow and ripen on the tree. U'machnisin l'kiyim b'kli shel kapos tamarim. So you end up taking them. Fine. So those are allowed to be eaten because they're not ready for meiser. Okay. Tiny idach daish, my daish miyuchad ever shlo nigma malachto lechala. So not that nigma malachto meiser, but rather it's not completed for chala. I've called ever shlo nigma malachto lechala poyoichabay. Yotza, that comes to exclude halosh, one who is kneading, v'hame katef, one who's braiding, v'ofeh, and baking. Should nigma malachto lechala. And when it's nigma malachtai for chala, then po'oichaboy. V'lo nigma malachto meiser. So it's in 1 second. But is it still? It's gemara malacha for meiser. It may not yet be gemara malacha for chala, but nonetheless you should still not be able to eat it because of meiser. Says Rashi. V'lo nigma malachto meiser utachina v'har kada, the sifting and grinding. The kamei lisha namiloichel. You can't eat it at that point either because it's chayv and meiser. Lokasha. B'chutzal Aretz Askinon. Here we're talking about outside of Eretz Yisrael. The lake of Meiser. There's no din Meiser. So you're right. If we're talking about Eretz Yisrael, there's a din Meiser. However, here we're talking about Chutzal Aretz. Yehachi Chalanami Leika. So what do you mean? If we're talking about Chutzal Aretz, there's no chal either. El Olam Ba'aretz. So then, how do we understand this? There's a chiyuv already in Meiser. Lokasha. B'sheva shekivshu v'sheva shechilku. Is referring to during the 7 years, in the times of Yehoshua, when he was conquering the land for 7 years and dividing it. Do you ever more? Sheva shekivshu v'sheva shechilku nischayva b'chal v'nischayva b'meiser. So at that time, we were chayav only in chal and not in meiser. So therefore, that's what we're talking about. So midi meiser kagarim. Understand? It's not meiser that causes the workers not to be able to eat it. Gamar malacha kagarim. It's the fact that it's because we went out from Daesh. It shouldn't make any difference whether it's bizman meiser or not bizman meiser. So what's the difference? The point is, it's totally on, is it something which is gamar malacha? So el ravina kroy chutni. You should actually combine them. Daesh ma daesh miyuchad ever shlo nigmar malachtoi lo meiser ulachala. It's something which is not fit for at the time. It's not completed, that there's no chiyuv of meiser or chala. Po oichabay av kol shenig malachto meiser chala po oichabo. Iboihu. Now the Gemara asks a different question. Mahu, what is the din shehavhev ba'or? Can you roast this in fire? That's the question. In order to, Rashi says mimatek taimo, in order to sweeten its taste. V'yoichel mihavi ka'anavim v'davaracher. We said, when you pluck grapes, you can't dip them into salt because then you'll end up eating more of them. You can only eat just the produce that you're harvesting. Do we say that when it comes to roasting, it's considered like you're improving it and therefore that's not allowed? Hello, because after all, you're not adding anything to it. So Tashma, that the Balabais is allowed to provide for his workers wine, in order that they shouldn't eat a lot of grapes. So let them get a little bit shicker, if you will, and by doing that, they're not going to eat as much. But here, workers are allowed to dip bread into vinegar, so that they should be able to eat a lot of grapes. So we see that these things are allowed to be done. So as we continue to pay Testament Bays, the Gemara says, Lakshuri Gavra Lokim Boilon. It says Rashi, also of Torah. Certainly that's allowed. You're allowed to do these things. Kikim Boilon, the whole question is Lakshuri Peira. Are you allowed to prepare and change the fruit into juice? That's the question. Tashma that the workers would eat grapes at the head where the workers Barashi Umniyos Shemehen. It says Rashi Shuros Sakarim at the top of their at the rows of the vineyard. And it says here but you're not allowed to scorch it with fire. So we see clearly not allowed to. No, the only reason why they weren't allowed to because it takes time. They're not going to, by doing all this preparation, cooking and roasting and singeing, so they're taking away from their job. That certainly they can't do. Let's say my wife, the Poil's wife, can prepare the food, so there's no bitul malacha because the guy is still working. The question is it allowed to be done? Tashma lo yahav v'or. It says clearly not allowed to cook this up with fire. It says, look at Rashi over here. The ika ishu banav shel niskru eitzel bal habayis. They're not working for the bal habayis. So it says you can't singe it with fire. V'yoichel and eat. V'lo yichmor ba'adam v'yoichel. You can't warm it up in the earth in order to eat it. V'lo yafrich al gav yasela. And you can't bang it against a rock. It says like people do that for apples apparently. V'yoichel. Avo, what could you do? Mafrich al yad v'yoichel. You can crush it from hand to hand. So we see clearly it says you're not allowed to do it. It's only because of bitul malacha you're not allowed to do it. However, again, if your wife is doing it, the question is not allowed. It's logical that's the reason. Because these are mishum matuki pear, because you're sweetening the fruit. Selam my matuki pear ika. What's this whole notion with banging onto a rock? So efshar the lo maptik porta, because it's maybe it is sweetening up a little bit. Tashma. Let's say workers that are picking figs, v'goydrin b'tamarim, and they're harvesting up dates, u'baitzrim ba'anavim, they're harvesting grapes, u'moiskin b'zeisim, and olives, hari'elu oichlin, they're allowed to eat all these things, u'paturin, and they're going to be pater from meiser. It's not an issue. Shahatayru zichsalahem, because the Torah is mazaka that they should be able to eat these things. Okay, but pitam lo yoichel. However, with bread, we don't want them to eat it because they'll end up eating a lot. If the Baal Bayis says you can, that's of course, then that's different. And then it says v'lo yispois b'melech v'yoichel. It says clearly you're not supposed to be dipping it into salt and eating it. So we see clearly it must. This is what it's talking about. It's yishua navim v'davar acher. It's comparable dipping grapes into salt. So we see clearly preparing fruit is usher. We're dealing with salt. It's definitely comparable to anavim v'davar acher. That's not a question. That's not allowed. The question is roasting it. It says you're not allowed to dip it into salt. Or a person hires workers to add there to plow or to dig rather. Rashi says kashkesh, or to cover up roots, says Rashi l'chasos shiroshav, covering up roots, tachas azeitim, underneath olives. Harizel yoichel. You're not allowed to eat anything. You're not allowed to eat from the olives of the tree because you need shas gemar malacha, and this is not considered gemar malacha. Sarchel litzar, soichel limsoik, sarchel lakate. Let's say they were hired to harvest the grapes or the olives or other fruits. How we say yoichel pater shater zichselhen, because again it's gemar malacha. Katzatz. Let's say the worker stipulated, says Rashi, the hisneim habal bayis almana shaychel. The worker stipulated that I'm going to do this job on condition that I eat. So says Rashi, heavily kain mekach. It's comparable to like a sale. So even though the Torah says he has no rights, but it was part of the deal for working between the worker and the Baal Bayis, so that's different. So katzatz achas v'achas yoichel shtayim or yoichel. Says Rashi, one you can eat. The pachlis mishtayim l'chayil iser shem garin. But there was shnigma malachti. It was not gemar malacha. So if you just one, it's not a problem because it's not considered like a set amount or like a chilus keva. Well, yoichel 2 cannot be eaten. Why? Because that's already considered to be like a davar choshev, and it will take upon itself the shem gairin to therefore be chayiv and meiser, and therefore for that reason you can't eat 2. Okay. For soifes b'melech v'yoichel, it says again you could dip it into salt and eat. So hey, what is that statement going on? Ilema seifa, is it going on the last part? So kivan de katzat says he already made a deal with the Baal Bayis. He stipulated that he's going to be able to eat it. So whatever he wants, he should be able to eat. So obviously, he should be able to dip it into salt. You don't even need to mention there's not a chiddush. El lava reisha, Rather, it's talking about the ratio, talking about a case where there was not designated, there was no stipulation, that he didn't say that I want to have rights to this, and therefore it still says you can still dip. So I'm Rabbi Lukasha. So what's the difference between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz? So the Gemara elaborates. Be'aretz kavas sefisa. When it comes to Eretz Yisrael, says Rashi, the Ma'aser Deraisa, there's a Chiv Deraisa, separating Ma'aser, Hukva Sefisa, the Sefisa B'melach Gemar Malach Taihu. That once you start dipping into salt, that's considered to be like Gemar Malacha. The Goi Daita the Le Gairin Achrina. There's no other ending point. And therefore, if you're dipping it in Eretz Yisrael, that's where it becomes problematic. But if we're dealing with in Chutz La'aretz, then we are not as strict. Okay. So again, kan b'chutz la'aretz, b'aretz kavas sefisa, b'chutz la'aretz lo kavas sefisa. Samar Rava mi'ikamidid b'aretz kavas sefisa midaraisa. The midaraisa, it's considered to be like chayiv and meiser because you dipped it. B'chutz la'aretz lo kavas sefisa mutal chatchila, and it's completely mutter. That doesn't make any sense. It should at least be a chiv d'Rabbanan, and we know that kol tikkun Rabbanan came d'Raisa tikkun. Whenever there's a din d'Rabbanan, it's kiyul d'Raisa. El Omer Rabbi different shot. Ben b'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz. Wherever we may be, Eretz Yisrael or Chutz La'aretz, chada lo kavas sefisa. If you only eat one, that is not going to be enough to be kaiveya it even by dipping. Tarti kavas sefisa. However, if you eat two, then by dipping it, it's considered to be that it's already kaiveya sefisa. Now, however, if katzatz, let's say, again, the worker stipulated, it's like a mekach, and therefore, bein safas, bein lot safas, whether dipped it or not, achas oichel, shtaim lo yoichel. One he can eat, not two. Lo katzatz, if he didn't make a stipulation, v'loy safas, and he didn't dip it, oichel shtaim, then he could eat two, safas achas oichel. If he dipped it, he can eat one, shtaim lo yoichel, but not two. The Afagav the Notor Rishus Mabal Bias, even though he got permission, the Itbol Hulu Meiser Bekavala Sfisa. Nonetheless, it's going to be Kaiveyet by him dipping into it. So, basically, the Reisha is when you're not Katzatz. It's when the Poil did not designate or stipulate. Rather, it was a biblical Rishus to eat. He was allowed to eat it. So, therefore, you can't dip it into salt. Even one at a time. Without salt, you could eat two. But the seifa is when you're a katzatz. So you could dip it into salt one at a time, not two, since that'll be kaver for meiser. We'll see the answer to this question explained a little bit better in Deer Shoes question 14 in a second. The tarti, when it comes to two, the kavas visa, that's already considered to be like it's completed. So menolan. So Amramas, the neighbor called the pasuk says, ki kibtsam ka'amir garnoi, that when you gathered up against your gairin. So says Rashi, in garin below kibbutz, is without gathering it up. In kibbutz pachas mishtayim, and to gather something up, you need to have two. And therefore, once you have two, that's considered to be like a gemar. Okay, we're going to stop there, but let's quickly look at question 14. Actually, first let's look at question 13. We may not have done. With someone who is plucking garlic and onions, o mavudol b'tamar v'gargaris mediayish l'fikach nesmat mechilas poyel. So he says menachesh b'shum b'tzalim enu gemar malacha. That's not considered to be the gemar malacha of the onions. El tikkun hamechubarim. Ha-boidel b'tamarim kvar nigmar malachta l'maiser. So as we said, when it comes to the onions and garlic, that's not gemar malacha. Ma hayishav l'stiras habraisas. How do we answer? The b'chada katani, with regard to one, nein seifus b'melch, you can't dip it. Yidach tani seifus. How come one place that says you could dip in one, and another one says you can't even dip in one? So reisha deloy katzatz. This is how he answers. The reisha is where you did not stipulate anything. Kivan de oichel. So therefore, once he eats shtayim 2, enu seifus, he cannot eat 2 and dip it, the kaval meiser. But if he dipped into salt, he couldn't do not even 1. But again, we're talking about shloi katzatz, and if he eats 2, he's not allowed to dip. Save for the katzatz, or he made a stipulation. Enu oichel el achas. Seifus to loikavas svisa ba'achas. And what happened is he took 1 and he dipped it into salt. Fine. And therefore that is the answer. Now let's see, maybe there's another question. Maybe. Maybe question 15. Let's see. Okay, yeah. So TA 15. Ad masei poil oichel but tamarim bevachitim. So when can he start eating? When can he eat until? So tamarim ad gemar malacha meiser. Bevachitin ad gemar malacha lachala. Ad kan.